Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Robert Levine.
So when I talk about the book, which I've been doing for a while now, the first question I usually get is, why did you write the book? And my answer is usually, well, after being an editor at Billboard, I wanted to do something that was much more difficult than running a weekly magazine about a business that was in the process of falling apart, and I couldn't think of that many things, and this was one of them. The serious answer is that I wanted to share what I had seen in the music business with people in other businesses and the wider world. As you can tell from my bio, I worked for both Wired and Billboard, which is probably makes me a bit unique among journalists. And there's a bit of a story there. When Napster came out, or not when it came out, after it came out, I was at Wired, and I thought this was the greatest thing ever. May surprise some of you, but I thought, well, first of all, I loved getting music for free, and who doesn't? Secondly, I thought, this is what the internet promised. It's going to give individual creators and independent companies a way to compete on an even playing field with big media companies, and that's going to create a better market, better entertainment, more choice, all these things that the internet promised when Al Gore invented it. And this, if you look back at some point in 2002, it can be seen on CNN arguing against Hillary Rosen, who you may remember is the head of the RIAA, that this was the best thing ever and the labels were foolish to resist it. So the next question is, well, why the hell did I change my mind? And the answer is, a lot of those things that I wanted and the things I predicted didn't really happen. We've seen music sales down by more than half in the US, vaguely similar results around the world. Music publishing, the copyrights on songs, that business is good, but it's under a lot of pressure. The concert business expanded and then contracted, but to a large extent, it depends on superstars that the major labels helped establish. The Rolling Stones, U2, and yes, Radiohead and Nine Inch Nails. There are statistics, you may have seen them, that show that music as a business is growing. And the way you get those statistics is you count sales of iPods. And if you count sales of iPods, the music business is growing. But that's a bit like saying your business has never been better because people are buying more 42-inch plasma televisions. Yeah, I wouldn't be impressed either. So what happened to now let's look at what happened to musicians. If you're a musician, you do have fantastic tools at your disposal to run your career. That's what's great about the internet. That's what's great about technology. And nothing I'm going to say should imply or in any way say that that's not a great thing. You do have these tools. But you went from being able to get a deal, a record deal with one of 5 major labels. There was a sense that there were too few major labels. Now you could sell your music through iTunes, Amazon, and Google. That doesn't seem like more companies. All of them have a very powerful hold on the market. All of them may give you more money, but they will not lend you money when you need it to get your career going. A lot of people say you can make money playing live, but before you make money playing live, you spend money playing live, generally speaking. So you could think of this as the ghost of TV and movies future, a future I hope doesn't come to pass. But remember that your businesses depend much more on copyright than music. Unlike music, very few of you make that much money in merchandise. Some do. Very few of you make that much money on performing live. And this puts a lot of pressure on you. I could say that with some authority because I'm in the book business. I mean, in a very small way, I should say. I'm in the book business. And I depend for my livelihood on the sale or license of copyright. There's a limited amount of demand to see me perform live, as you can see yourself. So far, and I would encourage any of you to prove me wrong, there is very limited demand for Rob Levine t-shirts. And in fairness, such a product is not available, I know. But there are some businesses where it's just very difficult to make a primary income on what is in effect a secondary business. So for the last decade, we've all heard a story. It's a story about big companies trying to lock down the internet against people's human rights. It's a story of old companies versus new ideas, dumb companies versus smart innovators, greedy companies versus the open, generous, spirited folk of Silicon Valley. They live in 5-car garages in Palo Alto. It's heartbreaking. So if you want to get a sense of this story, the moment I think when this story crystallized to the point in the public's mind that it was very difficult to change was when Metallica took on Napster. And now I know that seems like, wait, didn't I have a VCR then? Yeah, it was a long time ago. Don't worry, you still look great. And what happened, if you remember, is that the way it was done was very theatrical. Lars Ulrich, the Metallica drummer, went to Napster headquarters in a chauffeured SUV with his attorney. In the back of the SUV were, I think, 30 some odd file boxes with the names of people who were uploading and distributing, in effect, using Napster, Metallica's music. Now, Metallica got a very bad rap for this. As it happens, Metallica always let fans tape their concerts for non-commercial use. And Metallica only became upset at Napster when they found on the service a song that they had not yet released. Much of that is forgotten about. The lesson here is never show up to a meeting in a chauffeured SUV with your attorney if you're in a rock band. But as ill-advised as this was from a publicity perspective, I'm going to read you something Lars Ulrich said. He said, he was talking about Napster, they're looking at the business like one day there will be a major IPO or an AOL-type company, this was a good thing then, is going to come and buy Napster out for $1 gazillion. Now, while he looked bad saying this in an impromptu press conference in a chauffeured SUV in the parking lot of Napster, for a guy who's a drummer in a heavy metal band, it's actually a remarkably astute comment. And as it happens, a month after Mr. Ulrich, as the Times calls him, said that, Napster got a lot of money from a venture capital firm. At that time, before they got the investment, Sean Fanning, who you always saw in front of Napster, talking about Napster and how important it was, only owned 30% of the company. His uncle, John Fanning, had taken the rest to expand the company. And what was interesting here is, while Napster had rightly criticized the music business for taking advantage of artists, which of course, I think it's fair to say it did, very few labels had ever ripped off their own nephews. So what I wanted to do is deliver a counter-narrative. And a counter-narrative is just the way that very pretentious writers say, I want to tell you the other side of the story. And I say counter-narrative instead of the other side of the story because I'm not sure that one narrative crowds out another narrative entirely. You can look at what happened in different ways. I think the way we're looking at it is not entirely untrue, but I think there's another way to look at it that would lead you to some different conclusions, and it's important to understand the different points of view before we try to understand what went wrong and how we could hopefully improve the situation. So if you think about it, this isn't a new argument. Metallica, in standing up for their rights as creators, had done something very similar to Charles Dickens and Victor Hugo. And there's no point to that at all. I just wanted to use Metallica and Victor Hugo and Charles Dickens in the same sentence in hopes that somewhere my high school English teacher is freaking out. But there are plenty of new and old companies on both sides of this. There's plenty of dumb and smart companies on both sides of this. You hear about very successful startups. They're the exception, not the rule. Just as successful bands and films are the exception, not the rule. As for greed, all companies are greedy. That's why they're companies. I would not go so far as to say that greed is good. I'm American, but I'm not that American. But I would say, having decided to write a book because it was what I wanted to do creatively, I did get an agent, and he did not sell it to the lowest bidder. He sold it to the highest bidder. Before you go crazy, this was, a limited number of bidders and a limited amount of money, I assure you. But, when people talk about creators are bad because they want money, that's something I've never totally understood. And as for the conflict between business and human rights, I really see this, to me, this is not a conflict between business and human rights. It is the single most pretentious supply chain dispute in history. If you are a supermarket and you're in the business of selling milk, the right price to sell milk is very high. The right price to buy milk is very low. The negotiations of this are fairly straightforward. Milk physically exists, it comes in cartons, and the person who has the milk sets the rules, more or less. Copyright has always been more complicated, but the essential pricing dynamic holds true. If you're in the distribution business, you want to make money. Sometimes you sell things, sometimes you advertise. There's different ways to make money. If you're making something, but if you're distributing, you want to buy it for as little as possible. And if you could get it for free, that would be even better. As far as rights, there's rights on both sides. The epigraph, to be really pretentious, the epigraph to my book is from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. This is not a Hollywood invention. This is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you're ever on television with somebody who's in one of these open rights groups, if you say this, they will start going like this. It's like a weird tick they have. And obviously, those rights don't trump rights on the other side. I think there's very few creators who have any kind of interest in silencing free speech. There's very few people who want to shut down the internet. I'll say, as someone who's been accused of wanting to shut down the internet, I certainly spend more time on it than one would suspect. But that's a whole other, it's probably more of a domestic dispute. My point is there are rights on both sides, and it's important to understand both points of view. So where are we now? I'm not blaming technology companies for what happened. I think there's plenty of blame to go around. But people say, do you want more enforcement? What's the solution to what's happening? How can we create a better market online? Do you want more enforcement or better services? And the answer is, I think it's foolish to choose between those. You need both. And I'm not even sure they're oppositional. If you look at the success of Netflix or iTunes, did that success come from the fact that they deliver great value to consumers? Or did it reflect the fact that what they're selling is illegal to get for nothing? I think the answer is both. But first of all, I want to go back a bit and again try to understand what happened. We argue about what's the effect of piracy, and it's very hard to figure out exactly what that is. Frequently, the MPAA is accused of exaggerating the effect of piracy. I think that's true. What's remarkable is that the other side, the technology business, is actually catching up. If you look at it as a contest between nonsense academic research, the technology companies are eroding the MPA's advantage very quickly. In May 2007, Industry Canada released a study saying that file sharing helped music sales. This was argued back and forth. Some people disagreed with it. There was apparently a problem with the regression analysis. And I looked at this for a long time and I tried to understand it. And I realized what many a journalist realizes when they look at these studies. I'm no good in math. So I did, as something, one of the tools available to me as a journalist, I called the woman who did the study and I asked her. And she said this was unfair. She was being attacked. The study was perfect. And anyway, it didn't really matter because there's almost no copyrighted music on the Pirate Bay. This was someone who was hired to do a study by Industry Canada that was cited as very influential. She said there's almost no copyrighted music on the Pirate Bay. Now, if you go on the Pirate Bay and you looked at the top files, a lot of it is copyrighted music. You also see endless studies now studying the fact that the movie business is fine because the US box office revenue keeps increasing. Most people find that incredibly compelling. Because most people, and I think this is where Hollywood might have taken aim and shot itself in the foot, every Monday there's stories about how well last weekend's movies did. But most of the money doesn't come from there, as you know. It depends, but about 20 to 25% of the revenue for most movies comes from the box office. US box office is often about half of that. So people doing these studies who look at US box office sales, do they somehow not know that the DVD market is so important? Or do they know that and they're ignoring it? I didn't answer that question in the book, I leave it to you. The exact effect of piracy, I think, is unknowable. I'm not sure, in one perspective, I'm not sure it matters that much. People argue about whether piracy is theft. You're not stealing anything. Would you download a car? Well, I can't download a car. The right answer is, I'm not sure why it matters. What matters is that all of this piracy is eroding the kind of market that the internet promised. The kind of market that I thought would emerge when Napster disrupted the old model. I thought, you have a disruptive technology, it will disrupt the market, things will settle. Napster said that they had replaced the major labels. But if you look at what they actually did, which was distribution, I think they replaced the trucks that drove CDs to stores. Now, no one ever got invited to good parties saying that they were entering the trucking business, so I understand why they changed that. But the fact is, the idea that things should be free online, a lot of this comes from confusing marginal cost with fixed cost. It's free to deliver a song by download, therefore it should be free. But the cost was never there in the first place. This is one of the most expensive pieces of physical media you can buy. I don't mean this book, it's a very good bargain. I mean a hardback book. It costs about $3.50 to print, pack, and ship, a little more if you allow for returns, of which hopefully there won't be many. But it costs much more than that. It's not because publishers are so greedy, they do like to make money. It's because they had to pay me to write the book. That's where a lot of the expense comes from. Although, in my case, not nearly enough. But in the case of movies and music, that's even more important. Now, unlike the book business, there's a lot of equipment that makes that easier and cheaper than ever. Great studio equipment, great filming equipment. But a lot of the expense still comes from people's expertise. A friend of mine was at a music and tech dinner and someone said, we can now put Abbey Road Studio into any Macintosh. And my friend, being a wise ass, said, where does George Martin go? And, okay, I mean, it's a joke, but when you think about it, those records, those Beatles records, a lot of the reason they sounded the way they did, it wasn't only because the band were geniuses, I think they were, But they were geniuses who were able to get the support they needed to realize their vision on disc. At the time, it was a vinyl disc. I'm not sure that matters much. They needed certain resources to translate that vision and make it a reality. That didn't consist, part of it was equipment, but part of it was getting the people to work on it. So right now, the problem with piracy is not the amount of things that sort of go missing as if from an imaginary warehouse. It's how it erodes the market. It's that technology companies can say, if the price isn't X, people will download it anyway, therefore the price should be X. The market in that sense is already broken. So what we need to think about is not arguing about what happened. We now need to think about how to fix it. In the book, one of the places I place a lot of the blame is a law called the DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It's a US law, but like a lot of US laws, a lot of people in the US seem to sort of imagine it should apply worldwide. Touchy audience for that joke probably, but you know, I'm not saying we should, I'm just saying a lot of people do. In the story you've heard, with big greedy companies and human rights on the other side, the big companies lobbied for this law. It prohibited the breaking of digital locks, and it provided a notice and takedown, system of notice and takedown and safe harbors. That's not untrue. But there was a lot of lobbying on both sides. On one side, you had big content companies, major labels, movie studios. A lot of them are fairly unsympathetic. On the other side, you had telecom companies who spend more money and have much more influence in Washington than the entertainment companies could ever imagine. On their side, and I think I would argue on their side since, are a lot of public interest groups that have a vision of public interest that some of you may have a hard time recognizing. I'll read one more quote from the book. The principal opposition, this is an early version of the bill, came from the Consumer Electronics Association, which has always opposed copyright, and the telecom companies, which didn't want to be bothered. Now, let me emphasize, I don't think that this is evil. I don't think that it's wrong. If you're a consumer electronics company, the cheaper content is, the cheaper books are, the more you want to pay for a Kindle. If books were free, how much would that Kindle be worth to you? It's not that it's wrong, it's just in their interest, and their interests don't coincide with yours. This isn't any kind of paranoia about big companies. I have a deal with Random House. I don't think that they're doing me a favor by publishing my book. They're doing it because they want to make money. The great thing about this system is that our interests coincide. The more copies of my book they sell, the more they make, the more I make. They take more of the money, they also took more of the risk. That seems fair. Now let's look at Amazon. Amazon gives writers a larger percentage. I like the sound of that, in principle. But they're not really that interested in selling more copies of a particular book. They're interested in selling more things to read that consist of letters. Anything with letters in it, hey, you might want a Kindle. That's not bad, it's just important to realize that those interests diverge. The DMCA, like a lot of the arguments we've been having since, from SOPA and PIPA to C11, it wasn't really about copyright, because what's legal and what's not didn't change that much. What they were about was liability. Who has it and what the penalty should be. In the quote-unquote real world, for lack of a better description, I'm sorry, we know what's legal and what's not. Online, you're dealing with a platform. You know when you make a movie, if you use music, you have to pay for it or find a pretty good reason why not. You have to pay for clips you use or have a good reason not to. On the internet, if you're in the platform business, you don't have to. The reason for this was that telecom companies went to Congress and said, if we're going to spend millions of dollars building out broadband infrastructure that Al Gore wanted, we can't risk being held liable for $150,000, that's a US figure, for every single Aerosmith song in our system. Seems pretty reasonable. Congress said, yes, we got this system that I think was very good for what it was intended to do. It was intended to shelter some other businesses. And I think that's smart. It was intended to protect innovation, and I think that's smart. It's also important to look at the way in which that fell short. To say that, I'll tell a story about Groove Shark. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, and how the DMCA became a business strategy. So Groove Shark says, our users upload music. They say they have the right to it. You can stream it. If your music is on our system and you don't like it, send us a takedown notice, we'll take it down. To give you a sense of how practical that is, Warner Music Group, one of the major labels, sent 800,000 takedown notices in 18 months for only some acts. Now, I don't see any tears here. Perhaps Warner Music Group is not a very sympathetic company. I get that. But how many of you have the resources to send out that amount of takedown notices, knowing that you could be liable if you misstate something? But that Groove Shark, if they look at their top 10 most popular songs and they see that, gosh, a lot of them seem to be copyrighted, don't have much liability. Now, I understand the argument on the other side. YouTube says, without this kind of safe harbor, you wouldn't have a YouTube. I'm very sympathetic to that. I think it's important. They also say, though, if you make us filter, it will be impossible to run a company like YouTube. That ignores one thing. YouTube is filtering content right now. And all the great stuff on YouTube, from the political stuff in the Middle East to user-generated content to all these new kinds of content, that's happening while YouTube is filtering. Filtering hasn't seemed to ruin that. YouTube also says, what about the next company? How much liability do you want to place on a startup in a garage? I do think that's an important question. But the other question on the other side is, how much of an advantage, a permanent baked-in advantage, do you want to give those startups? And at what point do they cease being eligible for that advantage? If YouTube believes that they need an advantage available to baby companies, at some point, they should grow out of that. So I wanted to talk a bit about two possible futures, commerce and chaos. Might be a bit dramatic. It's not as shoe-thumpingly dramatic as that. But first, I wanted to talk a bit about what's going on in Canada and how this sort of, what I'm saying, affects this market specifically. If you think about the market you're in, it's defined to a great extent by regulation. You know, I'm from New York. I live in Germany now, and I think it took me 6 months or a year before I realized how different the attitude toward media is. You know, you meet people who work for public television, and they're not sort of vaguely ashamed of it the way they might be in the US. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I see that as a shortcoming of the US, but that's a whole other, I'm not going to get into that. It's a very different attitude. Some of the regulations they have strike me as very funny. I shouldn't say funny, odd. I know, from what I know about some of the regulations here, and I'm not an expert, some of them strike me as, well, I can't imagine people in the US going for that. I think that's okay. One of the things we need to keep in mind online is that the regulations you have in Canada, you voted for. I don't mean you directly voted for each regulation, but your government enacted them. It's a democratically elected government. Television stations here and other broadcasters have certain responsibilities according to the law. Your emergent competition online right now has none of those responsibilities. And I'm generalizing here based on what I know about Europe and these issues in general, doesn't seem to have much of a plan to transition into those responsibilities. If you were to ask YouTube how much of their content is Canadian, I'm not sure they would say I'm not sure they would make an argument about how much of it should be Canadian. I suspect they would say they wouldn't tell you. The US, especially Silicon Valley, we often like to think US law applies online. And companies act like that. One of the examples I usually use, some people say, well, why is Europe so different? I said, well, Facebook, if you think away Facebook, and this is a bit getting out of copyright, but Facebook has been very aggressive about enforcing a prohibition against one particular kind of content: breasts. They have a zero tolerance for photos of breasts, even nursing children. Because in America, and I'm somewhat ashamed to say this, we believe that this is just like an unbelievable threat. People cannot be allowed to see breasts. But Facebook has a very laissez-faire attitude toward privacy. They change a policy, and then they tell you, and if the government reacts, they'll walk it back a bit. In Germany, people think that's a little weird because they're a little paranoid about the whole privacy issue. We'll just leave it at that. Breasts are not seen as a threat to public order, to put it mildly. So, puts you in a very interesting position in a lot of different markets, because for a long time, you had Hollywood on one side saying, we need to loosen regulations. A lot of local creators saying, these regulations protect us. Now, there are other platforms coming in from the other side and saying, should we even have these regulations? And they have more power. Whatever your opinion is of studios or major labels, there are a limited number of them. Choosing between 6 alternatives or 4 alternatives may not strike anyone as the ideal business situation to be in, but they certainly have much less market power than a YouTube or an iTunes. Now let's talk about a future that involves more commerce. I like to use the example of the American cable business. It's an unpopular example in America because cable has a bad name. Maybe it does here too to some extent. But I would argue that what cable did was really change television for the better in a very fundamental way. Think back toward the old model, and again, this is a US example, I apologize. In the US, we used to have 3 networks. They were only supported by advertising. The way you made money was to get the most eyeballs on your advertising. The more eyeballs you had, the more advertising money you made. The way you did this was you came up with a show that everyone would watch. How much did they like it? Who cares? The point is they were sitting in front of the TV and looking at it. You made more money. This resulted in a show called Mr. Ed. Different numbers of people laugh in different countries depending on how familiar they are with the show, but for those of you who don't know, it was a talking horse and we're really sorry. Cable came in, fundamentally changed the economics of TV because you had 2 revenue streams. One was advertising, the other is consumers were paying for content. They weren't paying directly, but they were paying for content. All of a sudden, the goal wasn't to get as many people as you could, no matter how much they liked it. The goal was to get people who liked something so much, they were willing to pay, or rather, liked it enough to, if their cable provider was going to cancel it, they would call up and hassle them not to. This resulted in Mad Men, Breaking Bad, and other shows like that, which incidentally also resulted in a lot of export value for the US. And sometimes this happened a bit gradually. It's hard to realize how much of a fundamental change this is. I think this is the first time, at least from a US perspective, when you can say, what's on TV, at least on cable, is much more sophisticated than what's in the theaters. Granted, that's sometimes a low bar, but it's a fundamental change, and it's a great change. And what did that was an orderly market. You can argue about that the market should be different, but doing things that people are willing to pay for, who figured it gets them to make better stuff? There was a recent online kerfluffle, for lack of a better word, about Game of Thrones. As you know, it's an HBO show, again in the US. You can't buy it while it's on HBO. I think about a year later, when the next season starts, they make it available on iTunes. And there was a video someone did where he tried to buy Gang of Thrones, realized he couldn't get it, and then he pirated it. And in a way, okay, he needed to see it, but if everyone downloads Game of Thrones without paying for it, where do you find the money to make Game of Thrones? And if the only way you can sell it is selling individual copies, who's going to stake you the money in advance? HBO, whatever its faults, has been very willing to take on ambitious projects because they have the money to do it. Their motivation, they have to make something that's so great that people are going to pay $15 to get one particular channel when they already have 110 others. That better be really good. But they've done it. People say, well, doesn't that make it hard to get? Yeah, it makes it hard to get. But that's part of business. If you can't stop people from getting something for the conditions they want instead of the conditions you want, you don't really have any kind of business. Sometimes those conditions involve advertising, sometimes they involve windowing, sometimes they involve money. But if you can't create some closure somewhere, some limit somewhere, it's very hard to be in any kind of business. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that this is a relatively minor issue. Last year, the most popular movie to download illegally was not something that was hard to find. It was not something that was only on cable. It was a movie called Fast Five. Blank stares. This is the 5th movie in the Fast and Furious series. You missed it too. And what I said is, that's not hard to buy. It's just hard to watch. And again, I'm just guessing. I hasten to say I'm just guessing. Now, I want to close by saying, this isn't all bad news by any means. I don't want to be the total Debbie Downer here. There's a lot of things that are happening that you should all be very happy about. One of them comes from a company that I've picked on a bit, YouTube. If you look at what YouTube's doing now, not only are they paying creators, they're giving creators advances to create content. As people who are in the business of creating content, this is exactly what you would want them to do. As people who enjoy arts and entertainment, it's something we all want them to do. And it creates jobs and economic activity. Now, why have they, and many of you would also say, by the way, hey, welcome to the business. I know you think it's easy. We'll see if you still feel that way in a year. But it's important to realize, how did we get here? Did we get here because YouTube was protected in order to start and get bigger? Or did we get here because YouTube was regulated? They didn't start regulated indirectly. They didn't start filtering content until after they were sued by Viacom. They didn't start offering creators advances until they wanted unique content for Google TV. And by the way, I don't think it's only one or the other. I think the answer is both. So I think you need balance. To me, the ideal copyright is something that's a bit shorter than it is, perhaps a bit narrower than it is, but it's also actually exists, if you will. You know, some people say, well, the copyright on your book, do you really want it 70 years after you're dead? No. But I would have liked the book to be only available from legitimate sellers for, let's say, 70 minutes after its legitimate release. That doesn't seem so crazy. That's the real problem we're talking about. I'll say a little bit about the pressure on the other side. You do need enforcement. We all also need to make content easier to buy. A lot of people have said prices are too high, prices need to be cut. If you look at what happened in the music business, consumers are usually much more convenience sensitive than they are price sensitive. iTunes raised prices. They raised the price of the most popular tracks to $1.29. People said, oh my God, you're going to sell less music. And they did. They sold about, it's hard to get very exact, they sold about 12% less music. And most of the songs, many of the songs, for 29% more money. Even a journalist who's bad at math knows that they made more money. Consumers are not as price sensitive as you'd think. but they are more convenience sensitive. They want to get things anywhere, and they want the experience to be really easy. I think if you look at iTunes and Netflix, there's a lot of emphasis placed on their technical genius, but what people need to pay more attention to is, I think, how good those interfaces are. Because, you know, everyone with their computer, if you think back to before computers were as reliable as they are now, which isn't that long ago, how many reboots or crashes were you willing to deal with something that you were using at work? Most people would say a fair amount. If there's an IT guy, hey, you need it, you have to put up with this. How about watching TV? How much inconvenience are you going to put up with to watch television? As an American, I say the answer is none at all. Sorry. You know, the remote control I have is really like quite complicated enough. I just want to point it and watch. The idea that my TV system is going to be more sophisticated actually has no appeal at all. I want it to be easier. And I think that's one reason why those companies do so well. I think there's room for a lot of business models here. Regulating the online market to protect legitimate commerce shouldn't prevent anyone from giving away content for free. That may be a good business for some. I'm not sure it's a great business for a lot of people, but we'll see. I'm certainly not against it. But all of this commerce means some regulation. If you have a functioning market, it needs to have some rules. And what's interesting is that in the US at least, and I think here too, we've confused this a great deal. All of a sudden, I appeared on a progressive radio show in the US, and they said to me, so you want the government to regulate the internet? I said, wait a minute, you're progressive. Don't you want the government to regulate stuff? Isn't this like your thing? Copyright is copyright, at its roots, which it strayed from, but at its roots, is supposed to ensure a fair market for culture. A lot of people want a fair market for everything else but culture, but I think we want one, and I think a regulated good market is something we all want. We can argue about what that business will look like and who will thrive in it, and not everyone will. Perhaps big companies will get smaller, perhaps small companies will get bigger. I think that's great. I don't want to protect, people say, oh, you're protecting legacy players. I wouldn't want to protect legacy players. What I would want to protect is this whole like wacky idea of like buying and selling stuff for money. That seems to work pretty well. I'm not ready to throw that out. We shouldn't forget that this is a business and it involves commerce. There's lots of claims about this is going to interfere with people's human rights. Any kind of protection will. But as I said, what we're really dealing with here is on some level a business dispute. It's important not to violate anyone's rights, but what we have here is a market that's coming into chaos. We have to make sure that it becomes a functioning market. And that means regulation. It means we shouldn't be allergic to regulation, because regulation, as much as bad regulation can destroy jobs, I know, and I think a lot of you would agree, at least to some extent, good regulation can create quite a bit of economic opportunity as well as some great artistic output. And now we'll take questions and dodge thrown vegetables. But I think they're pretty small, so. Well, just somebody flag when I'm talking too long. It's really complicated. I think that SOPA was a badly designed law. I don't mean that I'm necessarily against what it was trying to do, but the definitions in it were so vague that it had a lot of potential to be abused. I'd like to say that people who designed it did not design it that way on purpose. It's irrelevant. You shouldn't have a law that's open to abuse. I say this, and it's a bit of a bratty thing to say, but I think there's some truth to it. I don't think I'm not sure any government should pass 75-page laws that are almost impossible to understand. If you can't say it in 50 pages or so, you got to wonder why. By the same token, I think that misstep created an opening that opponents of the bill really hammered very hard. Not unlike Obamacare, because it was so complicated, it became everyone could see in it what they feared most about the government. And in America, that's always like a really big deal. Being afraid of the government is like our thing in a weird way. And, you know, so the conservatives said the unions are shutting down the internet. Liberals said conservatives are going to shut down the internet. I'm not sure who actually was going to shut down anything. And then, of course, you had a bit of a popular uprising, but that was really fueled by people who had business interests in it. I'm not saying they were wrong. I'm not defending the bill. But, you know, if NBC had gone dark for a whole day, if NBC had put a banner on the bottom of the screen saying, support SOPA, I'm not sure if that's actually illegal, but I think the FCC would have had a stern word with them. I think that companies using the platforms they have to exert influence on politics the way Google did, and especially the way Wikipedia did, is something we need to be very careful about. Because it's something that, if you think about people's issue with, you know, I'm afraid of media influence, a lot of it comes from this idea that people believe, you know, it comes from this idea that the media has all this power. As someone who's actually in the media, I don't know where they get this idea, quite frankly. I've never felt all that powerful, but whatever. Laws are meant to prevent this. There's laws that are supposed to prevent that power from being abused. As an example, we restrict foreign ownership of TV channels in the US. I think that we're going to need to think about that. How much should the platform creator be able to control the political messages on that platform? In this case, I don't think it was the all-time worst thing ever. But I think that it's something about, you know, is that going to be the only time people do that? Or are we going to start seeing it happen more and more? It's certainly, look, I mean, I want to be clear. I don't think technology companies have any monopoly on misbehavior. Some people even say Fox News is biased. But again, there's the laws that, you know, there's a set of laws that govern that. Fox News, theoretically at least, and I don't really know that much about it, stays on the right side of them. People have thought about this and enacted the kind of regulations that the American people want, which is usually pretty minimal, but that's, you know, it reflects in some ways what people want. I think we need to do that with the internet as well. Somebody ask another question, or I'm going to sit here with like a squinting into the light. Okay. Thank you so much.